Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Peters from the Poison Pen, sitting at home in my office. And joining us today is Patrick Millikin from the Poison Pen, another book reviewer at the Poison Pen, and to our great delight, Sarah Weinman, the new crime reviewer for the New York Times, which she has said is the job what you've always wanted.
I mean, I think what I said most accurately is that it's a job that I feel like I've been preparing my whole life for. And a few years ago, when the previous longtime crime reviewer, Marilyn Stasio, whose work I hold in the highest of esteem, when she was profiled by the Times, I was quoted in it as saying that she was revered and feared. And just reading over those quotes after the announcement was made public, I guess I realized, yeah, maybe I was angling for this. But of course, I had to go off and do all the things that I've done and review for elsewhere, other papers, and write my books and edit my anthologies, all of which I will continue to do. But obviously, it's such a thrill and an honor to be in the New York Times book review twice a month.
I wish it were more often. I've actually written to complain that it's not more often.
I think I appreciate the sentiment, but frankly, the workload is just fine by me. Having to review 8 books a month is quite a lot.
Well, I can't disagree with that, although lucky me, I get to review probably 200, but in a very shallow way. And in fact, Sarah, you have been an enormous help to me because I was wrestling around with a couple of slippery books that we have just done Zoom events for, and I have quoted you. And I was particularly grateful for your review of Caroline Kepnes's You. So I started out by saying Sarah Weinman in the New York Times book review says Caroline Kepnes must be some kind of storytelling sorcerer, and go on. And I do think that your language is just great. It's so lively and personal.
I mean, that's a function of, I think, the voice that I've developed over the course of my career, but also when I took over the column, my main goal was I need to read books that please me. And if I please myself, chances are that readers will be pleased as well. And so it's really important to me to write reviews in such a way where the language is lively, where people can be drawn in and be like, okay, why does Sarah like this book? Or why is she saying this particular thing about this particular book in this particular way? And even if they may not agree with my judgment, they can at least see, even in the 200 odd words allotted per book, why I arrived at the conclusion of the judgment that I did, and hoping that whatever their sensibility is, they can figure it out and match it up with my sensibility. So it's really important to me to convey that, but also let people know which books I think are of considerable merit. And when I do have an issue with a book, explain why to the best of my ability.
Patrick, you review for various publications. So what standards are you assigned books, or do you get to choose the books that you review?
Well, I mean, I review for Publishers Weekly. I mean, and they put me in the magazine, so it's not, I mean, the reviews themselves are anonymous, unless, every once in a while I can do a, like a signature review or a profile or something like that. But generally speaking, the editor there will say, he knows my tastes, and he'll say, hey, I got X, Y, and Z. Any of these sound good? So to a certain extent, I get to pick. And I'm not doing, I'm usually only doing one a month, maybe 2 a month, but usually just 1 a month. And so he has a pretty good idea of what he thinks I'll like. So that's nice. But I wanted to ask Sarah about, there is, PW and other places, they have their own kind of, unspoken style, and it becomes challenging and somewhat of an art to try to say something meaningful in 200 words. I get 205 words usually for Publishers Weekly. And so it's like, all right, express an opinion in the first sentence, do some vague kind of plot description, and, get in, get out. There's sort of a way to go about it. And, I've developed my own style of doing it, but I must say it's changing. My style is is kind of changing with the reviews. And I've been doing it for them anyway, for God, 15 plus years, maybe more. And shoot, I wish I could say the review I just wrote, but I can't. But I adopted a very different tone this time. And that was kind of fun, to sort of play with that a little bit. But
Yeah, I mean, I think that it depends. I try to go book by book, and a lot of it feels when I'm sitting down to write the review that I'm almost in some kind of weird fugue state. Like sometimes in some of the reviews, I'll quote really salient passages whenever possible, because I do feel like putting a quote in conveys what the writing style of the book is like and why people might like or dislike it. But I also feel like when I'm sitting down to write the review, it's almost like I have to take on this sort of impressionistic approach where I'm channeling my feelings about the book and conveying almost like a thematic sense of what it may be about. So Barbara, it's interesting you brought up the Caroline Kepnes piece, because I think that review already is one of my favorites of what I've written, because I came to that series not entirely cold, but I think I had read You, but I had not read Hidden Bodies. And so when I came to You Love Me, especially in light of there being the Netflix show, I felt like I had enough distance. So I just sort of dove right in, and there was this amazing voice. And I just spent the entire book being like, how did she do it? And that's where the whole storytelling sorcerer line came about, because it really felt like she was pulling off this neat trick, which is incredibly difficult to make the reader not only care about the psychopath, but be so entertaining in the process, and so au courant very much about social media and the way that we live now. So she's really juggling a lot. And so I had to kind of get all of that, and also some kind of precedent and some kind of context, and explain, okay, she's being compared a lot to Patricia Highsmith in the Ripley books, but she's actually, I think, going a step further, because the Ripley novels are in third person and she's in first person. And like, I didn't want to get too deeply into the Lolita weeds in light of what I've written about, but I definitely had that sense of, here's this amazingly unreliable narrator, and it's very difficult to pull off, but I was very impressed.
Yes, and it's not an easy book in a short space, not an easy book to talk about. I mean, I have the same problem you do, which is there's only so much room in each of our book news and so forth. Sometimes I don't even have 200 words. And I thought that your review of the Kepnes reflected her style. It was a bit of a mirror, which I thought was great, because her style is certainly different. And the pace of it is so rapid. There's not many places where you get to pause and take a breath while you're reading, Carolyn.
No, you have to sort of make those pauses for yourself.
Yeah.
But that's also, I think, a testament to how talented she is, that she does create this propulsiveness that you can't put it down. And so to do that, and to do that in a third book and still make room for additional volumes, I think really augurs well for what she's going to do next. But it's a very different thing to review Caroline Kepnes and review some of the other books in that same column. I think that it was Carla Holloway's Gone Missing in Harlem, which is a very different book and much more, or it's more literary in terms of structure and in scope. But I just really admired that book for what she was doing in the sort of characterization, and similarly what Saul Walchuk was doing and what Ivana Budrosic was doing. And so I think ultimately what I'm trying to do in each column is, if it's possible, to run the gamut of what the genre can offer, because it's so expansive and it's so broad, and so many types of books fall into this amorphous land of crime fiction, which is sometimes mysteries and sometimes thrillers and sometimes suspense, and sometimes it bleeds all at once. And that's what I love about the crime genre, is that it is elastic and so many things can fit in there. So ideally, I'd like to get everything in there in one column. That's not always possible, but certainly to have as wide a variety of books represented is always my goal.
Well, it is a very broad umbrella. And, it's an interesting question whether you choose books that are that fit a theme or whether you fit books that are really disparate. Marilyn used to give some of her columns titles such that you felt like all of the books were going to be reflective of it. And so that's a different question. Patrick mentioned that he is most often given a choice by the editor and then he gets to pick and choose. How do you select the books that you're going to read? Are you under any pressure from editors or publishers, or are you an entirely free spirit?
It's a mixture, and that's partly because of timing and also what books get assigned elsewhere. So for example, like my editor, Tina Jordan, and I have a shared Google Doc where I input about, say, 6 or 7 titles that I propose for any given column. And the reason that I go over 4 is because invariably some titles are spoken for. Let's say they've been assigned by other editors as standalone reviews. There's also a thriller columnist, Sarah Lyle, who's a writer at large at the paper. She does a lot of different stuff, but she's been writing this occasional thrillers column. I think the frequency may be upped, I'm not sure, but sometimes she'll call dibs on a book. So if that's the case, then I won't review it. So one book that Sarah Lyle reviewed very favorably, Who is Maud Dixon by Alexandra Andrews, that was the book that I was hoping to review myself, and obviously I couldn't, but we certainly actually share the same sentiment. I think that's a brilliant book. But every now and then something like that will happen, but mostly I try to work fairly far ahead in advance. So we're in April and I'm reading June titles right now because I find that I'm so used from prior columns and from my past work at Publishers Marketplace, where I was a news editor and reporter. I was always thinking about forthcoming books. So as a result, I find that if I think really far ahead, then I have a good sense of the landscape of what's coming up, and that helps me.
Good for you. I wish I could work 2 months ahead. I'm lucky to get 1 month ahead. I'm just putting May together and really, trying to encompass June. So Patrick, how far ahead do you generally get a book assigned to you? And
about the same as Sarah's talking about. Yeah, the one I just did was let's see, I just did a June and a July. And so those haven't come out yet, but they're kind of in the can. Yeah, it's funny, another kind of issue is that in some ways the anonymity of PW is sacrosanct. I need to keep that because like yourself, Sarah, we know so many people in this business, and I wanted to ask you about that. That's a tricky line, because you're friendly with a lot of authors, and of course Barbara knows everybody too, and so
How do I deal with that?
How do you navigate that very delicate area? Like say there's an author that's a really good friend of yours whose work you admire a lot, and your gut feeling is, this isn't quite, or you didn't think it was quite up to snuff. How do you balance that?
Well, this is where I think New York Times policy comes into play, because they have very hardline ethics guidelines and I have to abide by them. So before I filed my first column, I sent them a list of authors who I believed would pose a conflict of interest, or basically they called it my friends list. And, there are different standards for what poses a conflict, but I felt like if they had been to my house or I'd been to their house, and then
socialize.
But there's socializing and there's like true friendship here.
Right.
So like there's socializing where I meet a writer at BoucherCon and I have drinks with them in a group. I think that's not really cause for a conflict. This is where also, having had many conversations about this with Oline Cogdill, and I remember at a BoucherCon past, I moderated a panel on the ethics of crime reviewing, and Oline was on it, and I think Jennifer Jordan of Crime Spree was on it, and several other reviewers in the mystery fiction space. And I actually I don't want to say that I was more hardline then than I am now. I just think that I have a greater sense of context in terms of, ultimately it comes down to, if it's pretty clear that they're my friends, like if I talk to them a lot on social media, then I'm probably not going to review them. But if, like, I've glancingly met them or interacted with them in a friendly way, and let's say it's been a few years, I view that as fair game, because ultimately I might forget that I've had this interaction, or they might have forgotten, and it really does boil down to the work. And another thing that I think is potentially worth pointing out is that many of my friends in the crime world tend to be reviewed in a standalone fashion by the Times. So as a result, there are so many other writers who either I don't know at all or I don't know terribly well. And there are more each and every year. Like a debut author, I'm not going to know them. So that opens up the pool of books and authors whom I can review. And so what it comes down to is, if the Times had come to me like 5 years ago, I think I would have had to say no, because the proportion of writers I knew to the ones I did not know was too high. But now it's not that I've been out of the game, but obviously I've written a book and I've edited several anthologies, and my relationship to VoucherCon is a little bit different, because I've evolved from being just a fan, quote unquote, to coming as an author, to having obligations through my publisher. So these are all things that I keep in mind. So it has created some distance, which perhaps paradoxically makes it easier for me to find books to review.
Wow, but there's an interesting ethical issue there, though, in the sense that if it's somebody you know, and therefore you don't want to review it, and nobody else picks it up, then this author may very well be shut out of the New York Times. As
that's certainly it's something I try not to think too much about, because ultimately I think about it in the larger aggregate that there are 8 books a month, more or less. So that comes to 96 books a year, give or take. So that's still very few out of the hundreds that are published, maybe even thousands published in the genre each year. So I'm already having to call a lot.
But that's just 96 that you're doing.
Exactly.
I mean, there are plenty of other standalone reviews that come out. So that's not the sum total of the crime fiction that's reviewed by the Times, right?
Sure. But at the same time, I think Barbara brings up an excellent point, which is that certainly since I started reviewing for professional publications in 2004, the space for books being reviewed has shrunk dramatically. And so authors really are in a bind about declining review space. It's really tough. So I definitely get that. But ultimately, I try to kind of put that all aside and go back to my first principle, which is, which books do I have something to say and which please me, and therefore which books will engage the readers of my column, and thus they'll be interested in potentially wanting to read those books themselves.
Well, it sounds as though you don't have a problem in that, you're forced to review a book that you don't like. I personally think that the non-review is the better way to go for a book that I don't like, although every once in a while, since my reviews have to be framed quite differently than yours, because I'm selling books and actually virtually everybody I know, so it becomes extremely difficult. I find that if I really don't like a book, that I just don't include it, because it's a waste of space and it can be hurtful, unless there's something in it that provokes me to the point I have to say something. And
yeah, that's absolutely my sentiment as well. I certainly think a negative review of a debut novel does no one any good. Like that, like what is even the point of that? But for books that are by multi-published authors, if there's something specific that rankles me, it may be worth pointing out. And I have done that on occasion. There was, I think, one book by Nadine Matheson. It was her second book, called The Jigsaw Man. And the larger point that I had to make about that book was I thought she was a good writer, and I thought that her ability to write characters and pacing, it was all good. It's just that I have real trouble with the serial killer thriller. And I think that it's kind of a moribund subgenre. I think that you have to be extraordinary with that. And as a result, I felt like the failing was that particular subgenre, not really the author. But I also wanted to put that on the table as saying, here's my sensibility and here's my opinion on this. You're free to think something else, and that's okay. But it was a way of illustrating a larger point about a particular subgenre that I think needs to either be reinvented or cast aside for the time being.
Well, we're certainly in sync there. I've been having some hilarious conversations with Jane Ann Krentz and various other authors about the rise of the Gothic, which I predicted 2 years ago would be the next big thing. And here it is. In fact, there's a cozy Gothic coming out in June. I was like electrified when I saw that. So Patrick, how do you deal with it if they assign you a book and you decide you don't like it? What's your strategy?
Well, actually, I was just going to bring this up because it does happen from time to time. You know, I was going to mention the intended audience too of these different publications. They can be quite different.
Right.
You know, Publishers Weekly and some of the other places are definitely geared more towards a trade audience. You know, so librarians, you know, people in the book trade, and you know, I tend to be fairly generous, I must admit, in my reviews. I also recognize when the problem is me, you know, when this is a perfectly good book, it's just not to my taste. It's not it doesn't match what I like or what I look for in a book, but it certainly would to other people that do like it. So I'm very aware of that. And yeah, and the aims are a little different, you know, for us at the store. Yeah, we're cherry picking in a large extent because, you know, I'd much rather be very enthusiastic about the new Willie Blotton book and sell it and help promote it. And those goals are different than PW or you know, a newspaper review particularly. Yeah, but I'm very aware of, I try to find what's good about the book and try to identify, as I say, where the problem is me, not the book. And that happens quite a bit, you know.
So it happens to me as well. And I mean, it's funny you brought up that particular phrase because for many years I've joked that not to my taste is the get out of jail free phrase
Yes.
for reviewers.
Exactly.
I had a really horrific moment. I've never forgotten it because I used to be a bit more, do I want to say snobbish? I don't know, elitist, whatever word it is, critical, let's go with critical. Anyway, I was standing up in front of a huge audience at the Poison Pen, and one customer raised his hand and asked, if I'm not going to name the author, why author so-and-so hadn't been to the store and why we weren't promoting the author's books. And I launched into, you know, my reasons why, which were pretty forceful. And when I was done, he looked at me and he said, well, he said, you know, it's okay if you feel that way, but you're really letting down all of us who like this author's work by not, you know, bringing the author to the store or not giving us an opportunity. And I thought, okay, so, you know, that's true. What am I here for? Am I, you know, really here to sell my own taste, or am I really here to try, as a bookstore, to try to enable readers of all different stripes to find books that they like? I'm helped by the fact that our staff is fairly varied. So we have one staff member, he reviews heavily for Booklist, and he's very much into the romance and cozy genre. We have another one who is the mystery reviewer for Library Journal, and she has a different taste, but she's also our blogger. Patrick has you know, I can always find I almost always know when it's a Patrick's review. Although I
Well, if
totally blew it
you,
because I thought the Chris Offutt review that just came out, I thought it has to be Patrick.
it sounds like me, and I would have
It
done it if
did.
you signed it.
That does sound like a Patrick book. It's true.
It really, really was. So, I'm helped by the fact that I have other people, or I can quote you or whatever, and try to serve this enormous, we're looking at like 20 or 30,000 people that read our publications and all. How do I try to serve all of them and yet have some integrity? So that really probably comes into play mostly in our books of the month, and books that we highlight are the ones that, and then we can kind of let the others go. But I really took that lesson to heart from that customer.
No, that's a really important lesson to learn. And I think that's also why it's important for me not to sort of get stuck in my own personal ruts. Like I have certain subgenres that I love, and there are certain that I have loved less. But I also felt that it was important from the get-go that cozy be represented in the column, I think a little bit more than it may have been during Marilyn's tenure, because I know that there are so many crime fiction readers, and especially a lot of younger readers, a lot of readers who are from marginalized communities or from, not the crime readership that we have customarily thought of as the crime readership. And what books are being published that they are gravitating towards. And I want to kind of figure that out as well. So there has to be a mix of books that I'm personally gravitating towards, and others that might be more of a challenge, but that may offer a lot of pleasant surprises. I think that's important, that I don't just stick to what I already love from the get-go.
Well, you're right. And, I find that the First Mystery Club, which is the largest of our monthly book clubs, I think it's also important that in choosing those books, there's only 12 a year, that I try to, move around among different genres and different voices. I don't want them to all be the same. Otherwise, it's a discovery club to a great part. And I was interested, I've been wrestling with May. I finally settled on one. And sometimes, to be honest, the practicalities of actually getting books to an author and getting them signed in the store end up dictating which of several choices I might make, because it might be just too hard to
I hear that.
to nail down one. Or for example, Mirrorland, which I think is an interesting book by Carol Johnstone, not a particularly comfortable read, but an interesting read. She's in Scotland. So done there. We have a different club we can put her into. It doesn't require autograph. But the two that I really wrestled with were The Hunting Wives by
May Cobb, yeah.
Yep. And then The Photographer by Mary Carter Dixon. There was also a Chinese, a first mystery set in a village in China called Thief of Souls.
Yeah.
But anyway, the two, the Cobb and the Dixon, are huge amount of it immerses you in a world of social media, in Instagram, and people whose whole lives are defined, in fact, by Instagram and the bid. And this isn't a place that I go. I do the Instagram for the store hilariously, but I don't pay any attention to anybody else's Instagram. I don't even follow anybody. So I was having, I admit it, a lot of trouble trying to decide if either of these books made a lot of sense to me. Because my threshold question is, why are you even looking at all this? If you just turned off your device, then what's going on in the book would become not part of your life, not irrelevant. So I had to sort of overcome that. That's really stepping into a world that is quite different. And then how do you evaluate? In the end, as I say, it came down to a practicality. Also, May Cobb had written an earlier book, which I discovered late in the game. So she wrote a book for Midnight Ink, and so it doesn't really qualify as as if you're having that standard. So, but it's kind of a thing every month trying to work it out. Now, Patrick has a discussion club, a hard-boiled crime discussion club. So you're not looking, Patrick, at new books, but most of the time you're looking at older books. So how do you decide for your group that you're going to sit down and discuss? How do you decide what books you want to choose
Ah.
from?
Well, it's great because so many, we've done most of the A-listers, and now like B and, second, third, fourth tier pulp writers are being exhumed and brought back. And we love it. It's a lot of fun. I mean, we're doing The Conjure Man Dies this month.
Yeah.
And, we go back and forth, and it's a fairly stable core group. And so we're not really, we just pick what we like, and
Is it a group pick or is it a you pick?
often it's a me pick, but I put a bunch of things out there. Like we want to read Helen Nielsen, we'll read Helen Nielsen or Lee Brackett, or, just all kinds of interesting Peter Rabe. And, we love doing that stuff. We found with this group, Sarah, would be right up your alley, I think.
Yeah, based on the authors you just rattled off, it definitely would be.
So
Well-
you're really happy that Starkhouse is republishing a
Yeah.
lot of stuff and hard case crime and whatever. And I think it's great that there are smaller publishers who are, working hard at returning classics. I mean, we ended up selling Poison Pen Press to Source Books and they've taken it
Right.
over. I am really proud of the Library of Congress Crime Classics and the Library of Congress Crime Classics, which was my husband's idea. And they're also doing the Haunted Library. So that's another question, Sarah. Would you ever be looking at, republications of classics, or do you feel like your column has to be for new releases?
Well, I reviewed a reissue of a Dorothy B. Hughes novel, Ride the Pink Horse, that came out in March. And so, yes, reissues are definitely in my purview. Obviously, I don't want to do it, say, every month,
Right.
but there are a number of notable reissues that I have listed in my forthcoming book spreadsheet that I'm very curious about. I know that the LOC catalog, there's a couple that are very much on my radar already. I think Berkeley is putting out some reissues as well. And certainly
HarperCollins is doing, HarperCollins is the
HarperCollins.
whole line from Collins, really.
Right. And I think there's one coming out at the end of the year, an Anthony Berkeley novel that hasn't been published in almost a century. So I definitely, if I have room, I definitely want to write something about it because it's been scarce for these many decades. And Anthony Berkeley, aka Francis Isles, is a writer who I don't think I've really written extensively on, but I love Malice Before Thought and Before
Yeah.
the Fact. And I'm a little bit underread on him as Berkeley. So that's something that I would like to rectify. And to be able to do that in the pages of the Times is potentially a real asset. So I'm certainly not complaining on that score.
It would
you
be
done-
fun. It would be fun if the Times would actually do like the thriller thing that Sarah Lyle or Charles Finch occasionally writes. Maybe do, because they did a romance not long ago, maybe just do classics would be kind of fun. I will give you a personal push for Murder at the Met, which I have nailed the Library of Congress to republish, and partly because it reflects the trope in opera. I don't know that you'd ever want to reread it, but I mean, Helen Travel was remarkable. Probably the great Wagnerian soprano, maybe she and Birgit Nielsen would rank up there. But all the way through the book, I reread it, and I remember reading it like 50 years ago or whatever. All the way through the book, I kept thinking, is this really going to be the standard opera trope the way this book works out? And sure enough, I don't want to give it away. Sure enough, it is.
No, please don't.
No, I won't. But I really enjoy that. And of course, it's a wonderfully New York book from a person who loved mystery, but her life was way too full of music
Right,
for
of
her to
course.
spend a lot of time writing books. But I do love, and then I went back and reread Dinner at Antoine's, which I remembered was a huge success and sort of crimey in for the Library of Congress. And it was one of the worst things it was just awful. And, and I thought, so not all classics, you can't just assume that all classics.
No, it's important to have a sense of which classic crime novels actually still hold up and which do not. Or even if they do hold up, they might work differently because times have changed and we view things through different lenses. And I think it's really important to kind of re-examine classic books whenever possible.
Right. And at the same time, I don't think it's fair to review books of the past in light of modern sensibility and moral. I mean, you could hardly read Chandler if you really want to be anti-racist and so forth. I mean, there's some dreadful stuff in Chandler, but can you really go, you don't want to boulderize things. That would be awful.
No, boulderizing doesn't solve any problems. I'm very much a believer in context over censorship. I think that if, explaining or putting things in the necessary perspective to help guide readers in terms of, well, here's why these authors may have written these particular offensive things in the way that they did, but getting rid of them does no one any credit. In fact, Chandler's an interesting case because I think the French edition of The Long Goodbye was heavily censored until the 90s.
Really?
And yeah, I believe that was less about censorship and more about printer space. But if you were a French reader in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and you read The Long Goodbye that came out in Série Noire, it was only 200 pages, which is like half the book.
I had no idea. I think your phrase context over censorship is really brilliant. So Patrick, when you guys are rereading some of these classics, obviously you're running into those kinds of issues, with attitude, language, moral choices and all. What does your group say about stuff like that?
Well, I mean, yeah, part of reading these books is an interesting time capsule, and I think that's what's so fun about reading them and seeing the times reflected in the books. We get into that, but I think all of us are kind of hard-boiled enough to recognize that, hey, that they reflect the values of the times. So I'm really against the censorship aspect or the trying to correct the past. It is what it is.
No, I know it. And I think it's a tough row for historical novelists at the moment to try to navigate what's true to the past and what might be acceptable.
Yeah.
And, same problems with cultural appropriation, but we won't go there. So Sarah, have you found authors that you might not have read as a result of this new job?
I had alluded to cozy mysteries, but I feel like reading, say, Abby Collette, aka Abby Vandiver, her Game of Cones books, which are delightful, and there are a couple of other forthcoming cozies which they are in future columns, so I won't mention them quite yet. But I think just books that reflect communities that they've been written in tend to be very much my jam. The Ivana Bodrozic, which I think came out from Seven Stories Press, yeah. I had not heard much anything about it until I got a cold pitch from the publicist, and the PDF was attached. So I started reading and I thought, oh, this is a fascinating book set in the Balkans in the 90s. And it talked about journalism and it talked about intergenerational trauma. And I thought this was just a really good crime novel in translation. So I wanted to highlight it. So whenever is that chance to take a book that might not necessarily get as much attention, I think the Carla Holloway book as well, which comes out, I think it just came out this week. But again, that's published by Tri-Quarterly. So small presses, I definitely want to hear more from, and genres that I am not necessarily going to read immediately, I want to pay more attention to. I'd like to be able to review some Gothics. There were a couple that were on my radar, but I think they were spoken for, or just the timing may not have worked on a couple of them. So I know that there'll be some more Gothic novels coming down the pike. So
absolutely. No, you won't be hurting for Gothics. I'm sure that it really, it's interesting. People are always asking me, what is the next big thing? What's the next new thing? And if you really put out your antenna and you start paying attention, you can generally zero in on what it is that's going to come in. And I predicted the Australian crime wave was going to begin to edge out the Nordic because in part, the Nordic has been around so long. And the Gothic was kind of a natural extension, really, of trust no one. I mean,
Right.
so I mean, you can kind of see where those are coming. I too hope the serial killer genre doesn't come back. It's just not one of my favorites, but I'm not sure what I see as the next thing. But I think about it.
I
Patrick, do you
think
have?
part of the problem too is that a lot of the next whatever has been maybe not hamstrung, but certainly affected by the pandemic. And the fact that has posed so many additional questions about how to write crime fiction. I know some writers who decided arbitrarily to end their books right before March 2020. And I know of a couple of writers who are currently working on manuscripts that are directly addressing what has been happening over the past year plus. So I think that will also affect how and the ways in which the genre will evolve. I'm also looking out for different ways of writing the police procedural, because I do think that there do need to be some changes on that score. And I think I've already noticed that there's an uptick in PI fiction. And I think it comes back to, similar to the Gothic, this idea that we can't trust authority. So we have to go with individual people who will look out for societal interests. So I'm curious to see how that will grow and change over the next few years myself.
You will find that true in a lot of military fiction, or a lot of the action. We do a lot of events with guys. I mean, we launched Jack Carr the other day, Mark Rainey. We have a whole group. I'm really looking forward to Jack and Stephen Hunter talking together on May 7th, because this is not a swagger. It's not, it's a completely different book, in which I have to say I argued with him over the ending before he turned it in. And I'm interested to see, I haven't yet looked at it, but I'm going to be interested to see if I prevailed or if Hunter did his own thing and ignored me. But anyway, I think that you see that the enemy is most often ourselves. It's our own government. It's the ambitious, or the corrupt, or the venal, or whatever it is, which I think is, I mean, certainly the 4 years of Trump are leaving their mark, and certainly the pandemic will leave its mark. And it can't help but, just like 9/11 really shaped much of the world. And crime fiction is always cut along the edge of social change. That's my personal favorite quote about crime fiction. I think about Sarah Paresky, who particularly takes that to heart, but a lot of authors do. And if that's true, then real events do shape what's coming. So it'll be sort of interesting to see. So Patrick, is there anything you'd like to ask Sarah or say before we sign off?
Not really. I think we've hit all the important stuff.
What do you do when you get comments from customers? I think, that's sort of not a reviewer's thing, but it inevitably is a reaction to the reviews that we write. You do a lot of customer service. How do you handle that?
You mean customers who complain about something you've written or I've written?
Or or just disagree with us. Of course they're free to disagree, naturally, but
yeah. I usually just try to diffuse that stuff really fast. You can't please everybody. Yeah, I don't really get a lot of that, to be honest with you.
I think Lucky Bill has probably taken it over since he's doing more of the customer service. But it's interesting, Sarah. I mean, I get emails out of the blue from people who write about the strangest things, and generally the best rule is just not engage at all.
I definitely agree with that. I feel like my reviews are for readers, they're not for authors. So mostly if I get feedback, it's when a column goes up and I tweet the link, and some authors will tweet, especially if I have praised their book. And that's nice to see, but it's not obviously why I write the reviews. But on the occasion when I've had feedback of a negative variety, I think it is, like Patrick says, important to diffuse it. And it comes down to, this was my opinion and this is my taste, and you're free to disagree. And especially now that I'm a published author, I definitely have had negative reviews of my own book. And writing books is very difficult, and it's an achievement to get to the end and publish them. And then you have no control over how people are going to perceive the book that you wrote. So I think that's important for everybody to bear in mind.
Well, I was just going to say that's very interesting. And I guess a good question for you would be, has this changed your, have you become more sensitive as a reviewer after publishing your own book?
I'm not sure if it's sensitive. I think I just feel like I have a lot more empathy
Right.
for the process. I shudder to reread my reviews from when I had a column at the Baltimore Sun from 2004 to, I think it was 2011. And it also overlapped with when I reviewed a fair bit for the LA Times. But I know, because I had not published any anthologies or any full-length books, that my perspective was very different from what it is now. And frankly, I'm a much better writer. So all of that means that I think I just try to come in with a lot more grace and a lot more perspective, but also a lot more knowledge, because I've read a lot more and I have a broader sense of what the genre is currently, but also what it has been. And I think for me, it's important to draw on that mid-century knowledge that I've accumulated to kind of put current books in the perspective that, frankly, I think they need.
Yeah, I think it's a good exercise also to read out, you know, as you said, read outside your particular little niche. And some of the, you know, I've discovered a lot of great stuff by being assigned to review, but also with our signings, Barbara, you know, sometimes if you can't do it, if you're gone, you know, and I have to step in and do something that I wouldn't normally do, it's been really interesting, you know, like one of the best talks that I've had was the one with Gillian Cantor and Nuala O'Connor, you know, and you know, I like that sometimes, being forced to read something different. And you know,
Think about this week, how dizzying it has been. I had to sit down and talk to, think about it, Anne Hillerman, a stargazer, which I think is the best of her books so far. Then we had Jack Carr with Mark Rainey coming in. And then we moved on to, let's see, John Sanford, which is always a joy, but also challenging. And it went off in various interesting directions. And then let me think, yesterday was, what was yesterday? Tonight is Saul Lelchuk. And I agree with your review. So, you know, I'll be talking to
Brian Christie.
him. It was, Brian Christie, who I think is really going to hit it out of the park. I mean, he reminds me of Jack Carr in so many ways in terms of his own personal background. And you can just kind of see the star power rating out of these two guys, you know, so that's wonderful. And tomorrow we have a double Victorian. I have Anne Perry at noon, and then I have Will Thomas with the new author, Karen Noden, at 1:30. And so, you know, think about the whirlwind of different worlds that I have to go in and out of in order to talk to these people for an hour about their books and try to convey enthusiasm and appreciation and occasionally criticism. And, you know, but I got driven into it because I'm a bookseller. Sarah, what drove you into reviewing? Let's make that our final question. Why did you start reviewing books?
I started reviewing books because I loved crime fiction. It is my first and greatest love in all of books. It was when I first moved to New York for grad school at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in the Forensic Science Department. And I worked one day a week at the late great mystery bookstore Partners in Crime. And I started my old blog with the fanciful title of Confessions of an Idiosyncratic Mind. And from there, I reviewed for various fan publications like Deadly Pleasures and Crime Spree and First January magazine. And then a couple of book review editors at professional places like the Post, the Washington Post, also the Denver Post, and the Baltimore Sun assigned me books, and it kind of just went from there. So I fell into book reviewing, but it turned out to be the gateway for everything I have done since. And so it's, to me, the Times column is kind of a full circle thing for me. It's me coming back to my crime fiction roots, but with just all of the experience and knowledge and perspective that I've accumulated as a reviewer, as a reporter, as a publishing industry expert, as an author, as an editor of anthologies. All of those things feed into the columns now.
Well, that's a wonderful answer. And we're all excited that you are doing this. I sure have enjoyed the columns that you've done so far. And I
Thank you.
realize that 8 is a lot, but I'd be really happy if you got an extra column every now and then.
I'll let my editors know.
Yeah, do. Well, I have let your editor know. I thought, actually, I wasn't speaking just of you, but I was nagging them a bit about covering more genre fiction. I mean, there's a big tendency at the moment to review books that fall into social issues or have particular agenda or relate to particular communities, or a lot of nonfiction and political books and all. And I felt like last year the Times really shortchanged fiction. And that was really my comment to, is it Sarah? Is that her name? Anyway, whoever it is, Paula. I wrote to her and I just said, I'd love to see more of Sarah, but I think it would be great if we saw more fiction and more genre reviews than we do. So we'll see. I mean, the paper is evolving and its coverage is evolving. I feel really lucky that they're still printing the book review.
I definitely feel incredibly lucky and honored to be in the pages of the book review, and that there's so much space not only given over in print, but the expanding offerings online.
Yeah.
And not just reviews, but also the various features and related pieces that are books related. The fact that books often make page 1 of the Times, I feel like that's been happening more and more over the past few years. So there are all sorts of ways that books can be covered, and I'm very happy and thrilled that I can cover books the way that I do in the column.
I think you should be. We're all lucky too. So thanks for your time, Sarah. It's really a pleasure to talk to you. Patrick, thank you. I will see you and Mr. Walchuk at 5 o'clock this afternoon, which will really be fun. I thought, save me from danger. What is that? It save me from dangerous men.
Dangerous Men.
Oh God, it was just wonderful. It was funny and it was different. And I really enjoyed this second one. I think he has a great voice. So I worried.
Yeah, Nikki Griffin's a great character.
Yeah, really worried me slightly that it took him extra time to write it, but we'll hope that is not a permanent feature. We'll see. Anyway, thanks so much. And
thank you both. This was lovely.
It was really fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Patrick.
Bye.
Bye,
Good to see you,
Sarah.
Sarah.
Thanks for watching.
Bye.